So this is going to be an online only video. There aren't any students in the auditorium. You're all watching it together, and you need to be aware and open this page out of Canvas modules because those are the hot links that I can't give to you on this video for watching some other prepared videos that you'll find on YouTube for the most part. Okay, so let's go to our video, which is right here. So what we're doing is we're taking a look at climate change through looking at past climate changes. So we are going to go back into the millions and tens of thousands of years and take a look at climate change, and it will help us realize that yes, climates do change. Yes, vegetation migrates, fire regimes change. And as planners and recreators, we need to be looking long term, out 20 or 30 years when we may not even have snow at our ski resorts. So we are going to take a look at paleo climate change as a foundation for what's going to be happening in the next 50 or 100 years. And we're going to use a bunch of different tools. So let's just get going and take a look at them. Although I'm going to have you pause in just a moment and watch this first video. So these are the 1A, B, C videos. Only 1A is really required. B and C are just interesting. They're about mammoths and climate change. But yes, stop this video, go back to that Word document that you had to open up, and open up that 1A. Is this an ice age? It is 12.5 minutes long. There are 3 more minutes at the end that are questions from the week before, so you can stop it right there. All right, stop this video and move on to the next. All right, welcome back. You got this out of the video, so just very, very quickly, you can just see that these are interglacial periods. These are temperatures on the y-axis, colder and warmer than some average point. And then the long-term run, and then looking at the last couple thousand years. Okay, 160,000 years at the bottom. But you got that in that last video that you just watched. And then this is just a close-up of the last 10,000 years and taking a look at the brief period of warmer and how we're fluctuating. So from that video, you saw that we would normally be going into, maybe not for tens of thousands of years, another glacial period, but you also saw that nearly vertical line of our temperatures and our carbon dioxide warming up. So we have to be thinking about that when we're thinking about how to do vegetation, how to do recreation. Do we really want to do this planning for ski resorts like we are up in Little Cottonwood, and putting all the infrastructure up in the canyon for skiing when maybe the better place to put the infrastructure is down in the valley so we can use it just with regular population growth. What I mean by that is the transportation infrastructure, rather than building trains and gondolas in the canyon or extra lanes. We do want to be thinking about climate change and warming. So looking back at those periods from the video, especially the last 18,000 years, here are some of the conclusions from research. So the amount of diversity hasn't changed a lot in the last 2.5 million years. However, it is changing rapidly now. But the species distribution and abundance changed significantly, and that's not too big of a surprise. That if we have a lot more ice, a lot less land, temperatures are lower, the plants and the animals are going to survive, but they're going to have to move down to lower elevation or further south to get the warmth that they normally need in the longer growing seasons. So that last one is, the next one is tied right to it. Plant community compositions and distributions have changed, mainly in having to migrate is something you do with legs, but plants do it over time with seeds. And then fire regimes, which you've had one session on, but you also are going to get a little more this afternoon or whenever you're watching this. that there are long-term and short-term climate changes, and you will see that some of our fires, particularly some of our microhabitats and habitats like around ponderosa pine, do well with fire. In fact, they do poorly without fire, and same with lodgepole pine. And then we do have one confounding extra that we haven't had when we look at the prehistoric record, and that is because of people, we do have a lot of exotic plants and animals brought into our ecosystems, and that's quite a bit different. These are fascinating graphs. It'll take you a minute to figure out how they are. Just think of these as a glass cube. And in the vertical, we're looking at pollen change, both across elevation, which you see pollen is the vertical over there in A, and then the depth is elevation, going up in elevation toward the back of the cube, and then over to the right is time, times 1,000 years, so going back 15,000 years. So that nearest corner to us is the present. And then it's also the lowest elevation for this graph. Maybe that'll help you. So if we just look at that first line going from the 0 back to the pollen line, that's just the present. And so we are looking at Artemisia, which is sagebrush. Looks like many species. But looking at just that near line that would be up against the glass, you can see that it's more present in the present, sorry about that, at a little bit higher elevation than in the corner there. So, but then all those bumps throughout the inside of that cube are different elevations over different times. So you can see that if you follow just the first line going to the right from the 0, that we're going back in time at that same elevation. And so back in time, we also had a lot more Artemisia. So Artemisia going to the left, we find at elevation. Going to the right, we go back to cooler climates. Okay, so you can just, not that you're going to get the detail out of each one of these, but you can see how elevation and past climates, meaning over time, make for an interesting mix of how where the plants were growing and at what abundance. Abundance is presumed by the amount of pollen. So just a couple more species just to see that different species react differently over time, which is why our mix of plants and diversity changes over both elevation and over time, meaning with climate change. Okay, two more. Quercus, that's an oak. That's a really broad species, so that's kind of interesting. This is a low elevation oak, judging by its abundance here and not up high, which also means it doesn't go very far north. We'd have the same thing. And then, yeah, that unique tree, the giant sequoia, the redwood, the giant redwoods, is just in the present at certain elevations, fairly low elevations. This is just another way of looking at it. These are just straight pollen over time of a number of different species. So you see a pine, you see a juniper looking up at the top, a fir, an oak, and sagebrush again. And so anyway, just seeing that these vary over time is what we're trying to get out of this graph. And the same idea here. Now we're looking at fire over time. So time usually goes from left to right, and then the number of fire events is in the bottom graph, and the upper graph is the amount of charcoal that's found. So the amount of charcoal is meant to equate with the number of fires. So that also changes over time. From the present, you can see on that top graph, we have quite a few more fires in the last 5,000 years than we were going back to 11,000 years, where the place was probably covered with snow and ice. Okay, so the historic vegetation and prehistoric vegetation is a lot easier to measure than faunal diversity. However, there are some ways of finding and dating bones in the different layers inside caves. So we are able to get some of those. And then we have the big megafaunas that we're familiar with, which is why I threw in those extra videos on the woolly mammoth. That we did have a big extinction event about 10,000 years ago. We're seeing here that 43 genera went extinct in under 1,000 years, which is really fast. But there are records here that they're in the foothills of the Sierras. And just so you know, we didn't have so many woolly mammoths as mastodons. But yeah, every once in a while a mastodon skeleton shows up. Not too many years ago, a new subdivision was going in Sandy, and a mastodon skeleton was dug out of that. Okay, so they also are among the ones that went extinct about 10 million years ago. So how do we apply that to how do we apply climate change, plant and animal migration to management of our wild lands? So among the things that we're trying to do here is say that, yes, we are going to have to adapt to changing conditions. We are going to have to be flexible. We have in the past tried to, I can't remember if it's this screen or the next. It's coming up, so I'm getting ahead of myself. We've gone back and taken a look at photographs from over 100 years ago, or about that, and before we started suppressing fire, and we see that we have a much broader mix of, or a matrix of different microhabitat groups, or habitat types rather than ecosystem types. Some of it driven, an awful lot of it probably even driven by fire. And as we get further into this session, you'll see more on fire and how we have changed our habitat, which changes the diversity of plants. We start to stagnate. So you will see, once again, you've already had one lesson on fire, but you'll see some more support for having some controlled fires and allowing, in areas where there aren't any buildings or structures to worry about, or people living there, allowing fires to go wild in wilderness areas especially. So anyway, we need some flexibility in how we think. We can think pretty rigidly. And then if we really are having climate change, our plants are going to be, and our animals are going to be shifting again. And it's a problem because they tend to live in islands. What's left of the natural world are just islands. So we will be getting back to island biogeography later in the session. Okay, so this is a paper, if you ever want to dig it up, that I've been referencing on climate change and forest migration. Okay, a new topic, and I'm going to have you stop the video here in just a moment also. Let me introduce this topic, though, first, and then you'll get it reintroduced in the video. I'm sure you're familiar with looking down on the stumps of trees like this, and you're seeing the annual growth rings. You're going to learn that not every tree has annual growth rings, depending on the climate especially, but also the species. And we use those for dating. We can also get fooled, so we are going to dig a little deep into the details after these videos on how to do dendrochronology. So it's different from ring counting. So go ahead, pause the video, and watch that. Well, you need to be watching all three of these. So the first one, 2A, what is dendrochronology? When you're done with that, 2B, oh, that's an 8-minute one, so the minutes are here and on the piece of paper. Dendroclimatology, using tree rings to reconstruct past climates, and then 2C, Rocky Mountain forests at risk, growing impacts of climate change. So pause the video here and go back to the Word document and hit these links and then come back. All right, welcome back. So you now understand this picture. You might not have before watching those videos. So this is a fire-scarred tree, And you can see that down here in 1531, that was the first fire, and it killed this side of the tree. So the fire, this may have been the downhill side, and the flames were pushing up against this side. The rest of the tree survived, but it did burn it back there. And then the new rings that are growing off the back did wrap around and grow again until the next fire. And then this fire burned pretty severely on this side of the tree. So these are growths coming off from that side. We get another fire event, another fire event, another fire event. And the tree is barely living after this one. You can see that only a little bit has survived, but maybe there was one more fire that scorched it. So anyway, it's just interesting to look at those forest fires scarring that one tree. Okay, how did we get going on this? How did we discover these fire rings, or not fire rings, growth rings, and how they are measurements, or not measurements, a record of the climate in some trees? So it was, as you saw in the video, A.E. Douglas, who was an astronomer interested in sunspots, but ended up getting diverted into, not that he ever quit studying sunspots, but he got diverted into a technique that eventually became called Dendrochronology. Okay, and there in the southwest, oh, this is a picture of Pueblo Bonito in Chaco. There in the southwest, they had two chronologies. One, they were working on trees that were still growing, and then they would go back to the forest and find those. And then they also had a floating chronology that wasn't anchored to the present, just coring the beams in these ruins. So ancient wood that wasn't connected to the present. So they did look at those, and eventually they collected enough that there was some overlap. So anyway, you saw some of that in the video. So these are just among the many ruins that have wood in part of their structures. Some other interesting things here, we can date this, looks like a viola, by the pattern of rings. And we can go back to ancient dwellings and ancient ships that are on the seafloor. If we have a chronology from that local area, or from wherever we think the wood is from, then we can start putting some dates on those trees. They aren't necessarily the construction date of that building or that boat, but we can date those trees if we have a long enough running chronology. So, trying to understand that in a little more details. Looking here on the left, those tree rings are pretty evenly spaced. So there isn't a pattern, a unique pattern of dry years, wet years, good growth years, poor growth years. And then looking over here on the right, we have a record of good growth years and poor growth years. So poor growth year, for whatever reason, would be the small rings. There wasn't enough of something, time, temperature, nutrients, to grow more wood. And then we also have to have trees that have distinct growing seasons, where there is a distinct change in the type of the thickness of the cell walls, and that there's an abrupt stop. Going back, that tree on the left might be growing in a water source if the area is water limited, so drought limited. Maybe that tree was growing right next to a fairly big river. And then the one on the right might be up on a hillside or up on a cliff, where every year's snowfall matters. Okay, a couple more of the assumptions. Let's see, we already hit some of these. You have to have clearly defined annual growth rings. There are some trees for which, in some locations, which you don't have that. And then you also have to have a place where there's one distinct growth ring per year. Although you'll see some of the way we pattern is when we get some double rings, or actually we have missing rings too. So, and then the width of the annual ring must be relatively consistent around the tree bole, and it just means relatively uniform. So if a tree is on a hillside and it's tilted out, either the downhill side or the uphill side will grow more wood, depending on the species. This is reaction wood, but that's okay. They're proportionally relative. Okay. And then you do have to get enough samples running over a long enough amount of time, such as 50 years, to start getting recognizable patterns. All right, we have another video coming up. This is Elaine Kennedy Sutherland, who is the woman who taught me about the techniques and the theories and the methodology for dendrochronology. When I found this video that I'm going to have you watch, it took me a while to recognize her. You can see that when I knew her, she had long, thick, curly hair. And that's not what she's sporting these days. She is working for the Forest Service doing research. So she also talks about how we need this information when we're doing our planning, forest planning or BLM planning. She is specifically working at this time in fire history, but she's quite a biologist and is very aware of far more than just fire regime. So stop the video here, go back to your Word document, and stop and watch 3A Meet Dr. Elaine Kennedy Sutherland. All right, welcome back again. Hope you enjoyed that video. It's quite short. So that tool that's in her hands here, I don't think there's a good showing of that in the video. Rather than having to cut down a tree and take out a slice called a cookie, you can not kill the tree by using this increment borer. And you can see in the inset to the right that it's a sharp edge on the front and then it's threaded. And so that area in the center of the drill is hollow. So you do pull back out with the drill a little pencil-shaped piece of wood. So let's see, we already hit this. Cross-dating requires matching common patterns of wide and narrow rings into what we call a skeleton plot, because the different pieces of wood and the different trees, depending on whether you're looking at the young explosive growth or the old growth of a mature tree, the outer rings, it's the proportionality that we're matching rather than the actual width of the rings. So here's what it looks like. That's the core. Over to your right is the bark, and then you're getting toward the core of the tree, the center of the tree. It looks like he just may have hit the exact center. On the far left, you'll see one flat ring. All the rest are circling around it. Okay, so getting back to that idea, now these two cores on the top, on the left is the bark. So we know that outer ring is the year the tree died or the year that you cut this out. And you can see that the older the tree, so out toward the rim, the thinner the lines, because the tree is bigger now. So it's not going to grow as wide as much as it's going to grow tall and wrap around. So those are the proportions, but on another tree we might need to compare it to when it was young. So we really are not working with the actual widths, but the proportional widths. So without going too much into detail, looking at this spot is matching this spot. You can see those are fairly consistent rings, but now we've got some skinny rings right here. And they get represented on graph paper by being proportionally taller than the ones to either side. And so moving along, here's the 10-year mark. There it is right here. And we have a narrower spot here. And then they're wide, wide, wide. And then we get some narrow ones again, so they show up here. And so on. So what all you're marking are the narrowest rings proportional to the ones around them. So remember, a narrow ring here, up here on the upper left, is different than a narrow ring over here. So it's proportion and relative to the rings, the 5 rings to each side of it. Oh, okay. Now, this gets more complicated, so you can't just count rings because there are false rings. So sometimes we'll have an early frost and a tree will start to shut down, and then we might have a long, warm fall, and so they get going again. So it'll look like you're getting an end of the year ring, and you have to really get under a microscope and take a look at these things. You have to really sand down your wood so that you can really look down at the cell and the cell wall layer. So we do have a problem with false rings, years that appeared to end but didn't really. And especially over here, this on the far left is a false ring, and I'm not sure if that one was determined to be or not. Okay, so those are false rings. We also have, here's a great view just as a sketch. And we can see over here to the right that it was almost the end of the year, and then we got a little bit of extra growing season. So then the bark is on this side. All right. And then we have this problem too, a little bit hard to pick out here. But this looks like the annual ring, and it might be what it looks like most of the way around the tree. But look at this. We have two little lumps. So it looks like we had a really dry set of years here, and that only a little bit of tree was able to grow. And most of the tree didn't put on any wood at all. But for whatever reason, in this spot for those 2 years. So this would be an easy thing to miss. And this is why you need a 50-year record. Because you might catch some trees that have those, and then you'll have some that are missing, and you just can't quite match up your skeleton graphs. And you have to go back and see if you have the problem of missing rings that you're picking up in some trees and not in others. So false rings and missing rings are why we can't just count the rings. We can get fooled. So there really is quite a bit of study before you put together a true chronology. So this is 3 from the same. This is saying they're from red spruce trees, so they're all from the same site, and you can then see that proportionally they're different. But when we move them to a skeleton graph, like we have now down here at the bottom, we can start finding patterns that we can match up. So. Which reminds me of trying to match patterns when editing videos, because I'm trying to match voice patterns when I get different segments of video separated. Okay, so skeleton plots rather than direct measurements. And this is just a close-up of that set of skeleton plots at the bottom of the last picture. So, and some more. You can see how eventually creating one that's 1,000 years old with all the different pieces of wood, we finally connected to that floating one down at Pueblo Bonito and tied it to the present. So we could get some exact dates of that wood, which is great because then you're also doing radiocarbon dating of artifacts, of organic artifacts, and so they can cross-check each other. So more cores. This is now from a Doug fir. And, we covered this. How great. I already got ahead. So the skeleton plot, which is the stuff on the graph paper, or just a reminder or review that the narrow rings are what get marked. And then it's relative width to those of the 3 to 5 neighboring rings. And you can eyeball that like we are here. So everybody who draws them is going to draw that length just a teeny bit different. But so what we're looking at are combinations of, like here, we got a 2 and a 2. Here's a 3 and a 2, a 3 and a 2. But they do appear to match in enough different spots. And then if you do have a better lab, then you're measuring of the width and comparing it to the 5 on each side can be done by machine. So it still needs a person there to crank that through slowly, but the computer's doing the measuring and the comparison to the rings on each side. So this is when I would have you stop in class and we would do this. I could pass out some cores, and you would draw skeleton plots, and then you would start matching up your skeleton plots. But since we're not together, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to do that. So, okay, and then just things that you've seen. These are things that you're going to see in visitor centers, and just be able to date different things. So here they're talking about, anyway, you can see. I don't want to go into the biology of all of those. This is a close-up of a fire scar. We looked at that one tree that already had 7 fires that it had survived. This just is a drawing, which is a little bit easier to see how each of these outer rings curve in and start to close off the tree. And eventually they'll start growing together again if it's left unharmed long enough. And then you'll have a buried scar. They get really weird to date when you core into one. And then this is just the illustration of over here at A, or maybe some present trees, and we've got a core from that, and then we have a core, probably C is it to match the pattern that we were talking about, C coming off of a ruin, and B an ancient snag that's out there in the forest, and how we can make the connection all the way across from A, the present, to giving exact dates out here in C. Okay, here's a paper, again, if you want to look it up, that we're going to just now make some quick references from about land management. And so Forest Service has been, actually we mentioned this, so we'll go very, very quickly, that just the idea that we've been using historic information like photographs and trying to go back and recreate that current climate period. And what we're recognizing now down here is essentially saying that, yeah, there's quite a bit of variability, and we need to be careful to not get too rigid, recognizing that, the climate of 100 years ago isn't what we're experiencing now. So the idea that we are going to lock in within that historic current climate period is a dangerous idea, that we really are going to have less snow, warmer temperatures, different kinds of storms. So we need to be thinking about that as we're doing planning. All right, so we have these to take a look at again. We're shifting into wildfire. Elaine talked about how her work with dendrochronology is tied to fires. I spent a summer on the north slope of the Uintas doing a fire history study. Honestly, what we found was when the railroad tie hackers were coming through, they were probably really sloppy with their campfires, because we seemed to be able to match as they moved through the Uintas. So we didn't get a very natural fire regime, unfortunately. We really did get sloppy camping. And that's my opinion. My boss couldn't quite decide. So we ended up not publishing that paper. Okay, so yes, you get a review for the most part, because you got quite a bit of this earlier in the semester. But the two at the end, especially that 3D video, a new incident web for public website demonstration, that's one I find I'm going to quite often in the summer when I hear about new fires, and I just get really curious. This summer, a big chunk of the Uintas on the south slope, they closed the wilderness area because they were letting it burn there. They were fighting it madly down where the roads were, but up in the wilderness, they were letting it burn. And big chunks of the Uintas were closed to backpackers and hikers and horse people. So if you are curious, it's a great introduction to that incident website. I have it in my saved links and use it fairly often. All right, stop and watch those and come back here in about 20 minutes. All right, welcome back. And here's just out of some of these articles that, Quaternary Scientists are the people who are studying the last 25,000 years. And we're just looking at some comments here very quickly, that sometimes the scientists and the land managers and policymakers have very different perspectives. So here's just a reminder that scientists work with facts, but land managers and policymakers have more going on than that. They have communities that they have to support, and so it's never going to be a perfect match with what the ideal climate changes to the wildlife and the fauna, flora, where, yeah, sometimes you have to give and take a little bit with the land managers. And so the reverse is true too, that land managers recognize that you're trying to meet your visitors' wants and needs, and industry wants and needs, and you may not be able to. You may have to be able to say, hey, here's what the science is saying, and those trees aren't going to keep growing here. Anyway, so that's a relationship that you do have to be aware of. And the rec planners can get stuck in the middle too. It's not just the biologists with the forest. Okay, this is our last subject. It's the theory of island biogeography. And you might be thinking, what do you mean? We're islands. We are pretty landlocked out here in the West, and most of our forests are. But what you want to be thinking about it, and why a lot of this happens in the Great Basin, is these are islands of biogeography. So up here in the Alpine zone, if down below are hot deserts, which you have on both sides of the Tetons, on both sides of the Wind Rivers, north and south of the Uintas, west of the Wasatch, all the way across the Great Basin to the Sierra, the high alpine area, those are islands. Down in the bottom are deserts. So the deserts and the grasslands connect pretty well. You'll see sagebrush all the way across all the states I've just mentioned. But where the conifers grow is up here in the mountains. And then here we're above the conifers and really just looking at tundra species. And these are the first ones we're going to lose. So as the climate warms up and the trees are able to move up higher because they have longer growing seasons, these little tiny plants that are already struggling up here at this altitude are going to lose their homes. And we may end up transplanting, which the National Park Service has finally agreed that there's going to be some plant migration that's impossible now because national parks are also islands. And they may have to go and reseed with plants that haven't been native to that national park in the past. These are tough policy choices where we need to get the scientists and the policymakers and the land managers together, like we saw in that last slide. Okay, stop and watch this theory of island biogeography. It's a different video. It's put together by a student. I think they did a great job of simplifying and explaining why the different mountain ranges across the Great Basin have different plants and animals living on them. So take a look. Okay, welcome back. And butterflies is one of the studies. This one caught me by surprise because butterflies, like birds, can fly around. So they aren't going to fly as far as migrating birds. And of course, in the caterpillar stage, they aren't going anywhere far. So anyway, the conclusions out of this were a little bit surprising. Let's go ahead and take a look at them. And these are the mountain ranges that they examined for the different species or subspecies of butterflies. And here's what, I didn't outline anything here. Oh, here we go. Okay, so they examined species richness. You might recall from the video that species richness and distance and size of the island makes a difference. And they're saying that only one range had a significant relationship between species richness and area, so size. So, okay, and then their next conclusion, where did we go? Here we are. Relationships between species richness and elevation varied among the mountain ranges. Species richness decreased as elevation increased, so we kind of know that about elevation. It's harder to live up there. There aren't as many species as adapted to it. And that was true in 3 of the ranges and not in 2 of the others. Okay, so second, we compared our work with similar studies on montane mammals, which I find interesting. I mean, yeah, you do want to make that comparison, but montane animals like squirrels and chipmunks, they aren't going to run across those deserts, where there's a chance that a butterfly with a strong wind will make it across the desert. Okay, so what they found suggests that it may be appropriate to modify general paradigms of island biogeography faunas in the Great Basin. And I find that interesting because butterflies are pretty mobile compared to, say, a lizard or a snake. All right, and I think we have, that's all we're pulling out of there. So here we are looking at it. This is interesting. This is a different study. So this is chipmunks. And what we're doing is looking at some of the mountain ranges that have 1 species and another mountain range that has 2 species, and then another range in the middle that has both of them. And then we take a look at the distribution. So over here on our top row, I'm not going to try to pronounce these. Umbranus is exclusive in the rubies, and you can see it does a full elevation. And over here in the snake range, where it has competition from dorsalis, it's the high elevation one. And there's some overlap, but they seem to keep each other out. So this one does better at high elevation, and this guy does better at low elevation. But when there's no competition, this too, the low elevation one, will go all the way to the top. And then looking at it again, so dorsalis again, and yet another one. So dorsalis, you can see, is the low elevation chipmunk, but will spread out, and the high elevation quadrivitius, high elevation when there's competition, but will go and live down in the low elevation too. So interesting distributions across these islands. This is what the Galapagos show us as well. Let's see. Now here's one on kangaroo rats, different species of kangaroo rats. I've seen them far more than just in that corner. Oh well, must be yet a different species. And these are distributed, as you can see, with almost no overlap, suggesting they competitively exclude each other spatially rather than elevation. Also, we have, this would be our driest. This gets monsoonal rains. Don't know much about Texas. This is going to be hot down here, extra hot. So anyway, these are spaced out laterally with presumption of competition. Let's see. I think we are getting too deep for a recreation class. So I'm going to skip that after all. Skipping that. Okay, so we're now to our conclusions. We're going to wrap up here by taking a look at a local event. So yeah, 18,000 years ago, we were in full glacial, and the Wasatch had glaciers, the Little Cottonwood making it all the way out to the valley, the Big Cottonwood only coming partway down. The Uintas were absolutely buried in glaciers, running 10 and 15 miles long. I think one is 18 miles long. Out the Provo River, out the Weber River, out the Green River, out just all the slopes. All the drainages on both slopes, north and south slopes, were glaciated. And that's now gone. So, but we still have snow in the winter. So that's Kings Peak on the far left of that bottom photograph. So we do have cold, snowy winters still, and we do have ski resorts. But the question is, at the pattern we're going, whether it's 30 years or 50 years, we're not going to have skiable snow in the Wasatch. So back to that early question from the very opening slide. Should we be planning for a no-snow future in our national forests, especially where ski resorts are? Do we really want to be spending hundreds of millions of dollars on transportation improvements going to ski resorts that aren't going to exist not in my lifetime, but in yours and your children's lifetimes, we may not have skiing in the Wasatch. So to be thought about with NEPA, are these cumulative effects? Are these foreseeable effects? I think so. And we're having a hard time getting people to plan for more than the next 10 years. All right. Hope you enjoyed this session and take a look at those videos.